On the morning of April 30th, 1943, a fisherman off the southern coast of Spain noticed something floating in the water. At first, it may have looked like wreckage. Then the waves turned it over. It was the body of a man wearing a British military uniform. A life jacket was fastened around him. A briefcase was attached to his wrist by a chain. Inside his pockets were identification papers, keys, receipts, cigarettes, a photograph of a young woman, and several personal items that seemed to belong to an ordinary officer living an ordinary life. His name, according to the documents, was Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The evidence suggested that his aircraft had crashed into the sea while he was carrying highly sensitive military correspondence. The letters inside his briefcase appeared to reveal the Allies' next move. They suggested that British and American forces were preparing to invade Greece and Sardinia. Sicily, the most obvious target, was supposedly only a distraction. Spanish officials recovered the body. German intelligence obtained the information. The documents eventually reached Adolf Hitler. And he believed them. There was only one problem. Major William Martin had never existed. The letters were false. The photograph belonged to a woman he had never met. The personal memories in his pockets had been carefully manufactured. And the man floating in the water was not a soldier who had died in a plane crash. He was a dead homeless man whom British intelligence had transformed into one of the most convincing spies of the Second World War. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat, the plan that asked a question almost too strange to say aloud. Could a dead man deceive Hitler and help protect an entire invasion force? By early 1943, the Allies had pushed Axis forces out of much of North Africa. Their next challenge was clear. They needed to cross the Mediterranean and attack Hitler's European fortress. But where? Anyone looking at a map could see the obvious answer. Sicily. The island sat directly between North Africa and mainland Italy. Capturing it would help open Mediterranean shipping routes, place pressure on Italy, and create a path toward the European continent. And that was exactly the problem. Sicily was too obvious. If Allied planners could see it, the Germans could see it too. Hitler could reinforce the beaches, move aircraft closer, strengthen coastal defenses, and prepare reserves to crush the invasion as soon as the first landing craft reached shore. The Allies could not hide an operation of this size forever. Ships had to assemble. Soldiers had to train. Supplies had to move. The enemy would know that an attack was coming. So British intelligence decided that hiding the invasion was impossible. Instead, they would try to hide its destination. They needed Hitler to look at Sicily and decide that it was a trap. They needed him to believe the real blow would fall somewhere else. And to do that, they would not send a coded radio message. They would not rely on a captured spy. They would give the enemy something far more convincing. A secret document that appeared to have been lost by accident. But how do you allow the enemy to discover confidential military plans without making the discovery look deliberate? If the papers were left in a hotel room, the Germans might suspect a setup. If a British agent carried them across a border, that agent might be interrogated. If the documents were found too easily, they would look false. The papers needed to reach German intelligence through an event that no one appeared to control. An accident. A tragedy. A body washed ashore after an aircraft crash. The plan sounded like something from a spy novel. In fact, part of its inspiration really did come from fiction. At the beginning of the war, British naval intelligence circulated a document later known as the Trout Memo. It compared deceiving an enemy to fly fishing. The intelligence officer throws different ideas into the water and waits to see which one the enemy will bite. The memo included dozens of unusual deception proposals. One suggested allowing the enemy to discover a corpse carrying false military documents. The idea was described as not a very pleasant suggestion. The memo is closely associated with Ian Fleming, then working in British naval intelligence and later famous as the creator of James Bond. The corpse idea itself resembled a plot from an earlier novel by Basil Thomson. For a while, the proposal remained only an idea on paper. Then Charles Cholmondeley, a tall, extremely nearsighted Royal Air Force officer working with Britain's counterintelligence system, began developing a similar plan. He imagined a dead man appearing to have fallen from an aircraft into the sea. The body would carry documents suggesting a future Allied operation. The proposal initially seemed too dangerous and too unpredictable. A body could decompose incorrectly. The wrong people might recover it. The papers might never reach the Germans. A medical examination might expose the deception. Or German intelligence might recognize the entire plan as an obvious trick. But one senior intelligence figure found the concept intriguing. Cholmondeley was paired with Ewan Montagu, a naval intelligence officer and experienced barrister. They were very different men. Cholmondeley was imaginative, quiet and fascinated by unusual schemes. Montagu was analytical, confident and skilled at understanding how evidence could persuade, or mislead, an observer. Together, they began turning an unpleasant suggestion into a real operation. Its codename was chosen from an official list. Montagu's dark sense of humor approved of it immediately. Operation Mincemeat. But the plan depended on something they did not yet have. A body. Not just any body. It needed to be a recently deceased man of military age. The death had to resemble what a Spanish doctor might expect after an aircraft accident at sea. The family could not publicly demand answers. And the body had to be obtained without revealing one of Britain's most sensitive secrets. The operation could not begin until British intelligence found a dead man capable of living a completely invented life. The man eventually selected was Glynwr Michael, a homeless Welsh labourer who had died after ingesting rat poison. His body was kept in cold storage while Montagu, Cholmondeley and their colleagues prepared the deception. For decades, the world knew the corpse only as Major William Martin. Glynwr Michael's identity was formally added to the grave record in Welva in 1997. The transformation began with a uniform. The planners decided that their invented officer would belong to the Royal Marines. A standard battle dress uniform could fit without requiring a tailor to measure the body, a visit that would have been nearly impossible to explain. They gave him a name. William Martin. A common enough name not to attract unnecessary attention. They gave him a rank. Major. Senior enough to carry important correspondence, but not so senior that everyone in the military establishment would personally know him. Yet a uniform and identity card were not enough. A real person leaves evidence behind. A wallet slowly fills with the remains of everyday life. Receipts. Tickets. Keys. Photographs. Bills. Letters folded and unfolded until the paper softens along the creases. The Germans would inspect everything. One detail that felt too clean could destroy the entire operation. So British intelligence began constructing not merely a fake identity, but a personality. William Martin was careless with money. He carried an overdue bank notice. He had recently visited a theater. He owned ordinary personal items. He carried keys that seemed connected to a real home and a real routine. And he was in love. In his pocket was a photograph of a smiling woman named Pam. She was not really Pam. The photograph was of Jean Leslie, a young woman working in British intelligence. But to the man who would be found on the Spanish coast, she became a fiancée waiting for him to return. There was even a receipt for an engagement ring. The personal objects were known as pocket litter. To an intelligence officer, each item was evidence. Together they told a silent story. William Martin had existed before the morning his body appeared in the sea. He had worked. He had spent money. He had attended performances. He had disappointed his bank manager. He had fallen in love. And somewhere in Britain, a woman believed he was coming home. The documents needed to create one more important impression. Martin could not look too perfect. Real people make mistakes. They forget deadlines. They carry useless objects. They keep old receipts. A perfectly organized officer might look invented. An imperfect man felt real. That was the unsettling brilliance of the plan. The body could not speak. So every object had to speak for him. The personal identity was only the outer layer of the deception. The real weapon was inside the briefcase. British officers prepared letters that appeared to be private correspondence between senior Allied commanders. They did not read like direct invasion orders. That would have been too convenient. Instead, the letters referred casually to future operations, as if the writers already understood the larger plan and did not need to explain every detail. The wording suggested that Greece would be a major target. Sardinia was also presented as important. Sicily was mentioned in a way designed to make it appear secondary, a possible deception intended to distract Axis forces from the real attack. This was psychological warfare hidden inside polite military correspondence. The Germans were not being ordered to believe Greece was the target. They were being invited to discover it. That distinction mattered. Information feels more valuable when someone believes they stole it. The papers were placed in a briefcase. The case would be chained to Major Martin's wrist. But the chain itself had to make sense. If the briefcase remained permanently attached, it might look theatrical. The planners therefore made it appear that Martin had secured the case during the supposed flight for convenience and protection. Everything had to survive the sea. The ink could not dissolve. The papers needed to remain readable. The body had to drift toward the intended shore. And the location had to be chosen carefully. Spain was officially neutral during the war, but parts of Francisco Franco's government and military establishment were sympathetic to Germany. German intelligence had networks operating inside the country. The planners selected waters near Huelva, on Spain's southern coast, where they believed sensitive materials recovered by local officials had a good chance of reaching German hands. But even this created a delicate problem. Spain had to violate the privacy of British documents without admitting that it had done so. Britain needed to appear desperate to recover the briefcase. But not so desperate that the Spanish became afraid to open it. Montague's team therefore prepared a performance around the documents. After the body was found, British representatives would urgently request the return of the case. Messages would emphasize that the contents were highly sensitive. Some of those communications used channels the British knew or suspected the Germans could monitor. The more Britain appeared worried, the more valuable the papers would seem. The entire plan depended on several enemies behaving exactly as expected. The Spanish had to recover the corpse. Someone had to inspect the briefcase. German agents had to gain access. German analysts had to accept the papers. And Hitler had to trust their conclusions. One failure would turn Major William Martin back into what he truly was: a dead man carrying meaningless paper. In April 1943, the body was prepared for its final journey. It was placed inside a sealed container filled with dry ice to slow decomposition. The container was transported north and placed aboard the British submarine HMS Seraph. The submarine's crew was not initially told the full truth about its unusual cargo. When Seraph reached waters off southern Spain, the captain brought the submarine to the surface before dawn on April 30th. The body was removed from the container. Major William Martin was dressed in uniform. The briefcase was secured to him. A life jacket helped complete the appearance of a military passenger lost after an air accident. The crew placed the body into the dark water a little over a mile from the Spanish coast. The submarine then departed, leaving currents and chance to complete the mission. Imagine that moment. The submarine disappears beneath the surface. The sea becomes quiet again. There are no agents left to guide the operation. No radio control. No second attempt. The entire deception is now drifting alone toward the coast. Inside the dead man's pockets is a fabricated life. Attached to his wrist is a fictional invasion. And somewhere beyond the horizon, real soldiers are preparing to land on beaches defended by real guns. If the current carries the body away, the operation fails. If the corpse sinks, the operation fails. If the wrong official finds the documents and returns them unopened, the operation fails. If the Germans examine one tiny detail and recognize the lie, the Allies may reveal their true target. There was nothing more Montague or Chumley could do. The dead man had to finish the mission alone. The body reached the coast near Huelva and was recovered. Spanish authorities conducted an examination. The British consul, Francis Haselden, was present and encouraged the proceedings to end quickly, reducing the likelihood of a detailed investigation that might expose problems with the supposed drowning. Major William Martin was then buried with military honors in Huelva. But British intelligence was not primarily watching the funeral. They were watching the briefcase. Spanish naval authorities retained it. For days, German representatives sought access to the documents. At the same time, British communications demanded that the case be returned, carefully creating the appearance that London feared its secrets had been compromised. The briefcase was eventually returned to British control. The envelopes appeared sealed. For a moment, the operation seemed to have failed. Then specialists examined them more carefully. The papers showed subtle evidence of having been removed. The envelopes had apparently been opened without breaking their seals, using thin instruments to extract and replace the contents. Someone had read the letters. Someone had photographed them. The bait was gone. Now came the most dangerous question. Had the Germans swallowed it? British codebreakers began intercepting German communications. The evidence slowly appeared. The false information was moving upward through the German command structure. It was not being dismissed as suspicious. It was being treated as genuine intelligence. By May 14th, Hitler was discussing the threat to Greece and Sardinia and rejecting the belief that Sicily would be the main Allied landing point. German forces were moved or directed toward Greece, Sardinia and the Balkans. The 1st Panzer Division was sent to Greece, infantry divisions were shifted and Sardinia received additional defensive attention. Think about what had happened. A man who had possessed no military rank, no command and no knowledge of Allied strategy had entered the decision-making system of Nazi Germany. His invented bank problems had made him human. His imaginary fiancée had made him believable. His false letters had helped move real soldiers across Europe. And the enemy still did not know he had ever existed. On the night of July 9, 1943, Allied forces began the invasion of Sicily. Thousands of ships, landing craft, and aircraft moved toward the island. Soldiers entered rough water carrying weapons, equipment, and the knowledge that enemy defenses were waiting ahead. Operation Husky had begun. But the Axis response was shaped by the deception campaign surrounding it. The invasion achieved surprise, and Germany had committed additional attention and resources elsewhere. Even after troops landed in Sicily, Hitler continued to fear that the main attack might still come against Greece. Operation Mincemeat did not win the Sicilian campaign by itself. Real soldiers still had to fight across the island. Weather, logistics, air power, naval strength, and other deception operations also mattered. But Mincemeat helped reinforce the story the Allies needed Germany to believe. Sicily looked obvious because it was meant to look obvious. Greece looked secret because the Germans believed they had uncovered the evidence themselves. The deception contributed to the element of surprise and helped limit the reinforcements available to oppose the landings. Sicily was captured by Allied forces in a little over a month. The operations planners eventually received confirmation that their deception had succeeded. A famous message summarized the outcome using the language of the operation itself. The Germans had swallowed the story whole. Major William Martin had completed his mission. But the man beneath the uniform remained hidden. For years after the war, the public heard the story of the officer who never existed. Ewan Montague published an account titled The Man Who Never Was in 1953. The story became a bestseller, and was later adapted for film. But many details remained classified or incomplete. The name Gyndwr Michael was not publicly attached to the grave until decades later. In 1997, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission added wording acknowledging that the man buried as Major William Martin may have been Gyndwr Michael. His story creates an uncomfortable question. Was Glyndwr Michael a volunteer? No. He did not choose military service. He did not agree to become William Martin. He died alone and vulnerable, and afterward the state gave his body a new identity and sent it into one of history's most unusual intelligence operations. Yet his body helped carry a deception that may have protected Allied soldiers from stronger resistance during the invasion. That does not make the ethical question disappear. It makes it harder. Can a nation use the dead to protect the living? Does the outcome justify what was done? Should Glyndwr Michael be remembered as a victim, an unwilling participant, or a man whose death was given a purpose he never knew? History often celebrates Montagu, Cholmondeley, and the intelligence officers who designed the operation. Their creativity deserves recognition. But the plan could not have worked without the silent man at its center. He carried no weapon. He received no training. He heard no orders. Yet he crossed enemy lines more effectively than many living spies. His fictional name was William Martin. His real name was Glyndwr Michael. And for several months in 1943, both men existed at the same time. One in a grave in Spain. The other inside Hitler's mind. Operation Mincemeat succeeded because it did not rely on one perfect lie. It relied on dozens of small, ordinary truths. A used ticket. A bank notice. A photograph worn at the edges. A receipt for a ring. Keys in a pocket. The remains of a love story that had never happened. The planners understood something fundamental about deception. People rarely believe a lie because the main claim is impressive. They believe it because the smallest details feel real. The Germans did not simply believe the invasion documents. They believed the man carrying them. And Major William Martin was convincing because British intelligence gave him something more powerful than a uniform. They gave him a life. A life detailed enough to move through Spanish offices, German intelligence networks, and finally into Hitler's strategic calculations. The operation helped persuade German leaders to reinforce Greece, Sardinia, and the Balkans while the Allies prepared to strike Sicily. A corpse became an officer. An invented romance became evidence. A false letter moved real divisions. And a man who had died almost completely unknown became part of one of the most famous deception operations in military history. The story sounds impossible. Perhaps that was why it worked. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is not a bomb, a tank, or a gun. Sometimes it is a story the enemy desperately wants to believe.